All right, we are recording. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're here tonight with the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm Anastassia Gliadkovskaya, and I'm an independent journalist and an alumna of the Stabile Investigative Program at Columbia Journalism School. And tonight I'm here with Kerry Dolan, an assistant managing editor at Forbes, where she oversees the wealth team, as well as the signature Forbes 400 list of richest Americans and the world's billionaires list. Kerry, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, it's great to be here, Anastassia.
So let's dive right in. For starters, can you walk us through what the annual Forbes 400 and World's Billionaires lists are and why they're important?
Sure. So the lists they started out in 1982 with a list of the 400 richest Americans. And this was a brainchild of Malcolm Forbes, the son of the founder of Forbes magazine. And he came up with a number of having a list of the 400 richest Americans, inspired in part by the number of people who could fit in Lady Astor's ballroom back at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, because it was the 400 sort of people who mattered in New York City at the time that could fit into Lady Astor's ballroom. So that was kind of pulling on that list of the 400 richest Americans. And this wasn't, of course, about society. This was about who had the largest fortunes in the country. And the richest person at the time in 1982 was a guy who's not well known, Daniel Keith Ludwig, a shipping magnate, and he was worth $2 billion. And the bottom of the list, number 400 of the very first Forbes 400 list, was worth $75 million. And so it kind of made sense about 5 years later, in 1987, to start a separate list of the world's billionaires, because there were, a few billionaires at the top of the Forbes 400 list, but the bottom was far below $1 billion. So in 1987, Forbes launched a list of the world's billionaires, and that very first list had only 140 people on it. Altogether, they were worth $295 billion. And the richest person on the list was a Japanese industrialist named Yoshiaki Tsutsumi, and he was worth $20 billion, which was a lot of money at the time. I mean, it's still a lot of money, even today, no matter what. But what's happened over time is, so it kind of, the logic of having these two different lists sort of made sense then. And we've continued to do them. And usually what happens is the Forbes 400 list, it's just Americans, comes out every fall, October usually. And the list of the world's billionaires for the last number of years has come out usually in March or April. This year it came out in April. And what's happened is, over time, everyone on the Forbes 400 is a billionaire. And in fact, the poorest person on the Forbes 400 list is worth $2 billion. So even though, so essentially there's list on the billionaires be kind of confusing because they're both lists of billionaires, but they didn't start out that way. So now it's very exclusive, of course, to be on the Forbes 400 list, because you have to be worth more, you have to be worth $2 billion to get on that list. But yet what's happened with the billionaires list, there's no limit, right? Every billionaire in the world that we can find, we put on the list. And when we published our 2021 list, which, by the way, I should say, Anastassia helped work on this. She was a reporter on the list, as an intern for the team. We had 2,755 billionaires, which is the most billionaires we've ever had since 1987, since we started doing the list. And altogether, those 2,755 were worth $13.1 trillion. Americans have the biggest representation on the list with 724 billionaires, followed by China, which had more than 600. And then if you add Hong Kong, which we've been sort of counting separately, even though Hong Kong is part of China, it wasn't always part of mainland China. And so we sort of kept this tradition of counting the Hong Kong billionaires separately. But even if you lump in the 71 or so Hong Kong billionaires, the China has about 700. So getting pretty close to the United States. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, kind of that's the two lists that we do.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's fascinating. I didn't know that background. And I guess what would you say to the critics that say that, it's sort of a platform for the rich, or I guess what's important about these lists? Why is it important that we see these?
Yeah, I mean, I think the germ of the idea was this would be an interesting list to do and people would want to read it. And people do want to know about the rich and the powerful. But a part of the reason that we do it is to shine a light on who are the most powerful people in the world. If you control a fortune of $186 billion, which is what Jeff Bezos is worth today, we all know that Amazon is this incredibly powerful company. There may be other companies that we don't know about, right, that you can read about. I mean, a lot of these people that are on the list are not household names and do not have companies that are household names. So we're shining a light on who are the richest, most powerful people in our society. And the other thing I should say is we know that we are missing people. We know that of course, we are not omniscient. What we do when we do these lists is we have usually fairly conservative estimates for the net worths, particularly if it's a private company. If it's a public company like Amazon, it's number of shares that Jeff Bezos owns in the company times the share price on the day that we use to measure everybody's net worth, and that's pretty much it. And then we add in whatever he's sold, shares that he sold, taking out some taxes for those and stuff. But we basically only put people on the list there that we feel we can prove that they are worth $1 billion. People sometimes try and say that they're a billion, but then they never. I mean, I had this happen actually just after we published the list. Somebody reached out to me saying his client belongs on the list, and so I got on a phone call with them, and the guy couldn't tell me the revenues of his company, and I was. So, I mean, it's like, if you can't prove it, you're not going to, if you're not going to share financial statements, audited financial statements for a private company that I've never heard of, or that we've never heard of, you're probably not going to make the list. But anyway, back to your question, we feel like it's important for readers and for the world to know. And I feel like it is a reference point. I mean, we often see other publications referencing, Forbes estimates of somebody's net worth, in coverage of, the Jeff Bezoses, the Warren Buffetts, the Bill Gates, et cetera.
Yeah, definitely. Well, can we get a little more nitty gritty here? Can we talk about how these lists get put together? How are they divided amongst the team? And also maybe you can talk about how Forbes develops some of its evaluation methods.
Yeah, so the Billionaires list is a mammoth project. We have people all over the world doing research. We have a team based out of our New Jersey headquarters, Jersey City, New Jersey headquarters. Well, this past year, they've all been remote, but that's kind of the core of the team. I'm in the West Coast, I'm based in San Francisco, but Forbes has a bunch of licensed publications. So we've licensed our name to, for publishers that publish Forbes Russia, Forbes Czech, Forbes Israel, Forbes Mexico, Forbes Brazil, places like this. So we got help, so that all the Russian research is done by Forbes Russia. We have people in Czech Republic doing the Czech research. We had somebody from Forbes Israel helping us on some of the Israelis. We've got a team in China at Forbes China that does all the Chinese research, which is huge because there's, more than 600 Chinese billionaires. So it's definitely, and then we have freelancers in different parts of the world doing research on folks in Latin America and Asia. So it's something like more than 80 people, 80 reporters work on the list, and I might even be low on that count. But it takes several months, and we have every reporter is assigned a bunch of billionaires to update their net worth from the prior year, or we have maybe what we call suspects, people who we think maybe belong on the list. They've just had an initial public offering, or we've just heard about them from someone that maybe it's a private company that's just raised money from venture capital investors at a higher valuation. And we dole those out among the reporters, and then there's an editor that double checks each batch of each update. And Anastassia, maybe you can talk a little bit about, from your angle, because so you worked on folks in the Middle East. I'm trying to remember which ones you did.
Yeah, Italy, the Middle East. I believe a couple suspects were Chinese. So it's definitely all over the place, but it was so interesting to see, like, there were definitely certain types of valuation methods that were more common for certain regions. Like a lot of the Middle East folks had a lot of investments in real estate or hotels. So it was a lot of calculating, the value of those hotels using a valuation method for that. Versus folks in Italy who are much more just like private company owners. So that was a more of a straightforward like price to sales valuation. And it was interesting to get to talk to different analysts for different, to figure out different valuation methods for each region. And even the analysts, I guess that's something that I learned, that even analysts don't definitively know what necessarily the best method is for calculating the value of a private company, because these things can be so murky. We don't always know revenues. We don't always know, even the shareholder structure, how it's divided amongst the owners. So there's definitely a lot of back and forth with analysts and the editors to figure out the best, most accurate way to portray those fortunes.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point, because at the end of the day, these are estimates. Because we are not omniscient, we don't know what's in everybody's bank account. In some cases, we are estimating a company's revenues, although many times we do know revenues. But they're, you can differ on how to value a private company. And often, like an investment bank would, they'll sometimes do these reports on, well, for example, with Kanye West, he got some investment bank to value the Yeezy shoe deal that he has with Adidas. And, they use this net present value of the cash. And that's not how we do it. And that's like basically saying that, okay, well, this is assuming that you're going to continue to have increased sales of Yeezy shoes and this, that, the other thing. We were kind of backward looking. So instead of looking, we would use 2020 revenues, 2020 profits on a private company rather than expected 2021 revenues or expected 2021 profits. Whereas a lot of investment bank, valuations, analysts will be looking at forward expectations. So we're not building in any expectations. We're saying what's already happened, what's been proven so far. And so that's a little bit different, that I think we're much more conservative than many investment bank style valuations would be of private companies. But we also don't know, maybe there's people that have a lot of debt that we don't know about. Like we definitely, we don't claim to be perfect. And so we call these are estimates, but we take this very seriously. We put a lot of work into it. And we're always, we know that sometimes we maybe aren't right. And we're just always trying to, we welcome feedback. We reach out to every billionaire or their PR representative to get feedback. A lot of them do not respond, but some do. So there's a handful of people, and I know this is maybe a question that you were thinking of asking, but maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but
Go for it.
who we know every year there's going to be a certain number of people, maybe the same people, who I will not name, who are going to take up a lot of our time because they're going to argue that their clients, their billionaire clients' net worth is higher than we say it is. And so they'll lobby and try and, we'll ask for data, we'll ask for documentation, we'll ask for audited financial statements. But sometimes there's some real headbutting going on, and there's some people for whom this really matters. It tends to be the people for whom it's a big deal with their net worth tend to be owners of private companies, which sort of goes back to what I just said, is like there's different ways you could value private companies. And it's not, it's just not a straightforward number of shares of Netflix times Reed Hastings' stake in Netflix, right? So yeah, that the private company folks often are harder to value, I would say.
And I'm curious, I guess, like, as you say, it's so difficult to value these companies. What was the methodology? Like, how was it developed at Forbes? Has it grown over the years? Have you stuck with sort of the original concept?
So I wasn't there in 1987 when it started. I have been at Forbes a really long time, but not quite that long. I joined in 1994 as a reporter, and I was tasked with doing some of the research on the Latin American billionaires at the time, because I spoke Spanish a little bit. And the methodology is pretty much the same. I mean, for private companies, if we have the net income of a private company and the revenues, we'll look at that multiple of the price to sales, so the relationship between, basically what we do is, if it's a private company, we try and figure out what it would be worth if it were public. And so if the sector, let's say you're talking about steel, right? Steel prices are up now. So publicly traded steel companies today are probably trading at a higher ratio of, market cap to revenues, price to sales, than they were, 6 months ago. So we look at that. So that company, a private steel company would be worth more, on May 21st than it might have been worth, on February 21st. But what we do is we do the research over a couple of months, and we pick a day that we use stock prices for everybody. And then for private companies, we'll use that either multiple of earnings, the price to earnings ratio for publicly traded competitors, and apply that to the earnings for the private company in question. Or we'll use the average of a couple of different, price to sales, so that relationship between the market cap and the revenues for a couple of different publicly traded competitors, and then apply that to the revenues that we know for the private company. And then, of course, if the person doesn't own 100% of the company, then we just give them, if they own 80% of the private company, then we give them 80%. And we almost always, we apply a discount. Usually it's a 10% discount to those numbers for a private company, because private companies are more illiquid, and because we don't have full information, because it's private, we don't know as much about as we do about public companies in terms of financials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of math involved, and it was really exciting.
But it's not higher math. It's like, it's good.
It's definitely basic, but it's more than like my normal reporting job.
Right. Yeah.
So it is good to put
yes.
like my high school math skills to use.
You want to have a calculator,
Yes. Calculator is definitely very helpful. Let's see. So I guess when we're talking about reaching out to billionaires and interviewing billionaires, I know you spoke with Bill Gates earlier this year, and of course reporters on the Wealth team are often tasked with interviewing these big figures. Would you say that it's more intimidating than the average interview, and how do you prepare?
Over the years about some of these billionaires on our lists. Some of them are real kind of rags to riches immigrants who've made their way to the United States. One of my favorites is this guy, Shahid Khan, who came from Pakistan with, I don't know, he had like $45 in his pocket, and he got a job washing dishes in Michigan, and was going to school, and then he got a job at an auto parts company, and then he ended up buying an auto parts company, and now he like makes all these fenders for his company's called Flex and Gate, and he makes all these fenders and bumpers for all kinds of, and he bought the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's an NFL team owner. I mean, these are rare stories, right? They don't happen that often, but there are some like that where people start with nothing or very little, seize on a great business idea and turn it into something that's really valuable and that creates a lot of jobs, and have a great story to tell.
Yeah, it was really interesting to read their background and to see how different people came from different places. I also got to chat with one billionaire during my internship, and it was surprisingly normal. Like, he was very nice, and I think maybe that's a sort of isolated experience. But I just felt intimidated in terms of knowing the finances to talk about, because I also the interview was with him as well as the billionaire, as well as his CFO, his company's CFO. So just in terms of wrapping my head around all the very complex investments and being able to talk about them. But of course, like you said, it's all just about preparing.
That's great. I'm glad he was nice. That's good. Yeah. A lot of times I would say most of the time we end up talking with the PR people rather than the billionaires themselves. It's a little bit unusual. It's just less common. It's not that billionaires don't talk to us. It's less common that they do. So
I think we have a question in the chat really quick. Are they usually nice? I guess they can go for billionaires or PR people.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having a shouting match on the phone with one billionaire. That was probably almost 20 years ago. And it was about, I'm trying to remember, I think he didn't like the headline in this. It wasn't about his net worth. It was about like a story that had been written and didn't like the headline or something like that. But yeah, so some of them are not nice. And then the other thing is, of course, some of them may be not nice, to their employees, but they're nice to us because they're talking to journalists and they want to put on a good face. So, what we know, we have limited interaction with these people most of the time. I did have to say, spend a week with a Saudi prince and his handlers in Saudi Arabia. Gosh, I guess it was in 2008. So that's like the most time I've ever spent. I mean, I wasn't with him all the time, but every day we did, I was just escorted somewhere to go see some of his companies or have dinner at one of his crazy outdoor palaces. But yeah, so that's unusual to spend that much time with somebody. Usually it's like, you're meeting somebody for an hour, talking to them for an hour. So
yeah, now everything's over Zoom. You're not traveling to
I know, no traveling these days this year.
That's really cool though. And I guess this is a good segue into talking about how you deal with billionaires who inflate or deflate their numbers, whether or not they want to be on the list or not. Because I know some folks really don't want to be on the list and some folks really do want to be on the list. So how do we, how do we handle those cases?
Yeah, so the folks who say, I don't want to be on the list, take me off the list, what we say to them is, okay, well, if you can prove to this that you've given your fortune away or given enough of your fortune away so that you're worth less than $1 billion, sure. Early on, so I started out working at Forbes in New York. So back in the late 90s, a German retail billionaire and his New York-based lawyer came into the Forbes office and showed me a paper that said, listen, I've transferred the assets of my fortune to a charitable foundation, please take me off your list. And this was someone there had been a kidnapping attempt on his daughter. And so the family was trying to really stay out of the press, understandably. And so we took him off the list because it's like, so we don't count assets that are held in charitable foundations if they're irrevocably given to charitable foundations. Well, I found out years later that this was not an irrevocable gift to a charitable foundation. He actually still had control of the assets in the foundation. So he's back on the list. But we've had, a handful of times, there was one this year, we had one billionaire who's of Turkish descent based in Cyprus, who was able to prove to us that he had shifted his assets into a charitable foundation and he's been giving away, and he did come off the list. So it happens sometimes where if people, it's very rare that people are giving away, if you're worth 2 billion, that they're giving away 1.3 billion or something, 1.1 billion, that doesn't happen that often. On the other end of the spectrum, when people are saying, I'm worth more, or if they've, to your point, to your question, what if we find out that they've been misleading us? So that happened. My colleague, Dan Alexander, discovered that Wilbur Ross, who served as the Commerce Secretary under Donald Trump, had essentially somehow kind of misled his way onto the Forbes 400 list. And there's a good story on Forbes.com, you can read about it. And it's also in Dan's book, which is called White House Inc., which is mostly about Donald Trump, but this story's in there too. And one of the way that Dan figured out that Wilbur Ross was not worth $3 billion, which is what he'd been telling us, was that when you have a job in the federal government, like a head of if you're a cabinet member, you've got to file financial disclosures. And the financial disclosures had something like $700 million in them. And Dan called Wilbur Ross's office, or actually called Wilbur Ross, and he told Dan that he had transferred the assets to his family before he became the Commerce Secretary. But the thing is, the filings would have to have shown you're supposed to show not only what you own, but what your family owns, and they didn't show that. So we kind of went back through the records and realized that when in a way, it was Forbes' mistake. We had a reporter who misunderstood and assumed that he owned all of his private equity firm, which of course he did not. And we were over counting it. And then, we're fallible, right? That was a mistake that we put him on, but he never actually owned up to it. Anyway, so we took him off. And who knows? If anyone ever is in the same boat, if people know that we are listing someone on the list who shouldn't be on there, we want to hear about it. So if anyone is listening and wants to chime in, my email is kdolan@forbes.com.
That's great. And of course, there are cases where the billionaires are a little more misleading than that. And for example, like the Kylie Jenner case that I was reading about, there's also a story online after the fact that she, her team most likely, like Forbes, my understanding is Forbes had reporters out in LA in their home, and it seems like Forbes may have been shown falsified documents right then and there in person and didn't find out until after.
Yeah, that was interesting because at first the reporter doing that story had thought about Kylie Jenner, had thought, like, how could Kylie Jenner's makeup company be selling this much? She'd been hearing stuff and it just didn't make sense. And then it's like they showed us documents. It's like, okay, and everything that she was selling was super popular, all these Instagram followers, et cetera, et cetera. But then what happened was publicly traded company Coty bought a stake in Kylie Cosmetics and disclosed revenue numbers, and they didn't add up, and they were lower than what we had been told in the prior years. And so we put two and two together and realized that we had been misled, and knocked her down from $1 billion to 900 million or something like that. She's not poor.
That's a great reminder for sure. So you have been overseeing and helping put together these lists for over a decade, is that right?
Yeah, I started working on them in 1994, 95, and then I took over for a couple years in 96 in New York. And I moved to California in 2000. I handed it off to editor Louisa Kroll. And then there got to be so many billionaires by 2010 that the two of us became the two co-editors of the lists. So it's been since 2010, I suppose, that I've been doing this. It's a huge team. I definitely don't love it, right? It's totally a team effort.
But as someone who's been at the helm of this for a while, I guess, and you sort of touched on this with the growth of billionaires in general, and a lot of Chinese on the list. What's been surprising, I guess, over the course of the work to watch how this list developed?
So one of my colleagues reminded me that she had asked, she'd done a little piece, maybe I should go back and look now. I think it's like, maybe it was 7 or 8 years ago, asking about when we would have the first trillionaire. And I remember thinking, I can't even imagine a trillionaire. A trillion is so much. And that was when Bill Gates was worth like $55 billion. So at that point, I couldn't even imagine somebody being worth more than $100 billion. And here we are, in 2021, where we're, depending on the day, right, we have 8 or 9 people worth more than $100 billion, right? And Jeff Bezos a couple of times has gotten to be worth as much as $200 billion when Amazon stocks, peaked. So I think So maybe there will be a trillionaire, in my lifetime, I don't know. But yeah, the biggest surprise this year was just the sheer growth in the number of billionaires. We had 493 new billionaires on our list, what we published in April, which is a greater number of newcomers than ever before. The prior
in a pandemic.
Yeah, in a pandemic, yeah. And that was then also that's the other crazy thing, right? Yeah, where you have long lines at food banks, in our neighborhoods, and people not able to work. And then you have more billionaires than ever before and more new billionaires than ever before. Yeah, so we did the math. It was about one new billionaire every 17 hours, from the 2020 list to the 2021 list. Yeah, crazy. I mean, and you were getting, there's some crazy valuations in the stock market, to be sure, right? Some of these, and some of them have come back down to earth in the couple months since we did the list. Some of these this new thing called SPACs, the special purpose acquisition corporations, where you have essentially a blank check company that would go and merge with another company. And they've merged with companies, particularly in the electric vehicle industry, that have no revenues. They have no product. They're the new car from this company, Fisker. Well, first they said it's going to come out in 2022. Well, the other day they said, oh, it's going to come out in 2020, end of 2023. Like, there's not going to be any revenues for years. Right. And there were two billionaires from that company. Okay, neither of them are billionaires now because the stock price has come down. So some of it is just irrational exuberance, I would say. But then, and also Tesla. Elon Musk went from being worth nearly $26 billion in March 2020. And he's now, for our list in April, he was number 2 at $151 billion. Huge run up in the 700% increase in the stock in Tesla in that time. Just incredible. So that's like, I would never predict that, right? So it's like, there's just astounding stuff that is kind of head scratching sometimes, It's like,
yeah.
Does that valuation really make sense? I don't know.
I feel like so much stuff on the market these days is just purely speculative, like with a lot of cryptocurrency, and it's just like, it makes no sense. And it's just so volatile. And it's so funny because I know Forbes does these stories often of like, Jeff Bezos is the richest. No, Elon Musk is the richest. And it must be hard to decide like when, at what point do we keep covering?
Every day they were trading places in January a couple times. Well, even just today, one of the stories that was published today is so that Jeff Bezos is no longer the only person. He's now sharing the number 1 spot with this guy, Bernard Arnault from France. They're both worth the same amount today, $186 billion. Because Amazon stock came down and LVMH stock went up. But yeah, these, every day these things change. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's crazy.
Do you have a favorite part about doing this work? Could be coverage, could be the lists.
Yeah, no, I've certainly enjoyed, I've learned, what's fascinating is I'm always learning something, right? So learning about SPACs because we were like, also that was the other interesting thing this year was SPACs kind of took over the stock market in, late 2020 and early 2021. And we thought, oh my gosh, we're going to have all these new SPAC billionaires. And so we were like creating a new column in our internal spreadsheet for how many new SPAC billionaires. At the end of the day, there weren't that many new SPAC billionaires. We had, a dozen or so, but the SPACs were kind of, I think, they were great. And then they're kind of maybe also coming back down to earth. But, always learning about something new, somebody doing new, interesting story, interesting companies, interesting technologies, the cryptocurrency, learning about these new, and crypto was hot a couple of years ago and then it sort of fell and now it's back again. So there's always something, there's always something. And also just what's going on in other countries. I do feel like one of the things that's interesting is looking at the number of countries the number of billionaires a country has kind of as a proxy for how that country is doing and if the economy is overheated or not. When I started back in the mid 90s, there were 24 billionaires in Mexico. And then the peso got devalued, and then all of a sudden there were 10, right? And so, it was kind of, relative to the size of the Mexican economy at the time, that was a lot of billionaires compared, because back in the mid 90s, I think there were only like 300 something billionaires that we could find in the world. So that 24 was a lot for Mexico. So, so some of these Chinese stocks, I kind of wonder too, is like, really, should they, I mean, not that, China's a huge economy. It's not surprising that they have almost the same number of billionaires as the United States, but some of them, these stocks are also like some of the US stocks, trading at very rich multiples. So, you kind of wonder, how long is this going to last?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great point. Apart from obviously spending months putting these lists together every year, you also oversee the wealth team and have, I'm sure, a million editorial duties. So how do you manage your time?
It's so much of it is like, what's the biggest deadline of the day? I mean, we're always trying to keep track of, like who's, is Elon Musk down $10 billion today? Is Elon Musk up $8 billion? The ups and downs on a daily basis. Is there a new number one? We have this cool feature on this Forbes real-time billionaire tracker that tracks the net worths of the billionaires every day, and even throughout in the course of the day, it updates their net worth every 15 minutes when the stock market is open for the stock that they own. So we're definitely looking at that. We're also looking, also getting incoming, pitches for new stories and trying to figure out who should handle that. Coming up with stories for the magazine, and trying to figure out, what have we learned from the research we've done that we can turn into an interesting story. So yeah, I work with a great team of people. So communicating with them every day, we start out the day with a daily meeting, that you attended a lot of those, I think, Anastassia. So maybe you could talk about what your experience was like, how your schedule was like when you were at Forbes, like how your day went.
Yeah. Well, for the record, I think it was extremely organized for a place that has so much going on, so many moving parts, especially since I was brought on to help put together the world's billionaires list. So it was very organized. I feel like we all had a good sense of direction and a good sense of like what we needed to be doing. We were good at time management. I thought like we had clear deadlines. Yeah, the day started early with a general daily meeting with the entire Forbes editorial crew, and then we had a noon meeting with just the wealth team, and we were just plugging away at numbers and valuations. We were sending out a lot of emails to PR people and billionaires, a lot of back and forth on certain valuations, a lot of back and forth, of course, on Slack with the editors to figure out, what source are we going to be checking for this, or who else should we reach out to? Is this complete? And it's an interesting process. It's a very long process, but we have this internal spreadsheet where after we file something, we mark it as filed, but then an editor goes in, looks it over. If there's anything to us, then they'll make a note. So you have to go back into the file. So it's a lot of like jumping back and forth between different files, different billionaires in different regions. So it definitely exercises your muscles on how to like shift quickly, how to remember like what math you're doing here and what you're calculating and who you reached out to for this file. But yeah, it was just like weeks and weeks of that, but there was just, and we were part of fact checking as well. So we fact checked some magazine stories that were not really related necessarily to the billionaires list. But it was just exciting to work with the wealth team and more broadly with other folks who needed their stories fact checked. So
yeah, never dull, right?
never.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, I got to read this really long footnote in this SEC filing or whatever. Sometimes it's like a little bit kind of, you have to plod through a lot of legal jargon. But yeah, always something. There's always something going on.
Yeah.
It's yeah. And I, I'm on the phone a lot of the day talking with reporters who have questions or ideas or, things they want to double check. So there's yeah, it's kind of a mix of being on my computer and editing and talking to people and, all the stuff that you just said, the meetings and the like. Yeah, it's, yeah, I feel very lucky to have the job that I do. It's super interesting, and I like the people that I work with. And I feel like the work that we're doing is relevant. You know, it shines a light on important stuff. You know, and Forbes does celebrate entrepreneurial capitalism. You know, we are not shy about that. There are not saying that there are no problems with capitalism, and that things aren't changed, and that there are not bad actors. And so we definitely, when we find, you know, stories about people who have, you know, run afoul of the law, or have not acted in a great way, we definitely try and point that out. So, you know, we celebrate great achievements, but we also try and look out for shady deals.
Well, Forbes does a great job, for sure. Some of the stories that you find are just, no one else is out there looking at that stuff. So if it weren't, you know, those reporters, we wouldn't know about it. A last question for now before we turn to our audience. What advice do you have, if any, for reporters interested in this beat, or maybe working at Forbes? Anything they can do to better prepare?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this beat, I mean, there's so many, just like you said, there's so many great stories that Forbes has done about Billy. I mean, and I'd say other places too. I mean, the other interesting, I feel like there's been some great stories this year about this guy from the whose family office, Archegos, fell apart. I mean, there was like the Wall Street Journal did a really nice kind of pill apart on that one. I mean, I think the Wall Street Journal often does good stories a lot of times on billionaires. I mean, there are good stories everywhere. There's good stories in The Economist. There's good stories in the New York Times, Financial Times. But I'd say read the stories about, you know, if you're interested in the billionaires, read. And there's also some great books. I mean, you know, we shared a list inside the wealth team. I know Anastassia shared a few that she thought were great. But there's so many, like the book on you know, Theranos. I highly recommend John Carreyrou's book on Bad Blood. You know, Phil Knight's book, Shoe Dog, about starting Nike. I mean, there's so many goodness. Brad Stone's first book on Jeff Bezos and, you know, Amazon and the Everything Store, and now he's got a new one out, which is on my list to read. You know, the Ashley Vance's book on Elon Musk is so good. I mean, there's so many great books out there to read about these people. They're such fascinating characters. But there's if you don't have the time to read a whole book, you can read shorter stories, magazine stories on them, or online feature stories on them. Yeah, and yeah, working at Forbes, we often, yeah, we don't have a ton of turnover, but yeah, we do, you know, people do leave over time, and, you know, or move up and move out of the wealth team. So yeah, we do look at applications coming in the door. But, you know, if you're interested, we're looking for people who are self-starters, who are organized and careful and clear writers, and you know, and enthusiastic, you know, and interested in the beat, I would say.
That's great. Thank you. So let me turn to the chat here and see what questions we have.
We have a grand total of 4 participants. Is that right? Do we only have 4 participants?
I think there may be people tuned in on Facebook Live as well.
Okay. Okay.
Let's see. So I think Adam's question we sort of answered earlier. When will the
in terms of when will we have the world's first trillionaire? I mean, it's an interesting question because I didn't actually say when. I mean, I don't really know, but you know, if Amazon stock, I could probably do the math, right? If Amazon stock kept growing at the rate that it has, and, you know, if Bezos holds on to his stock, which, you know, he's been selling some of it, you know, could he get to be a trillionaire within a decade? I don't know. You have the law of big numbers, right? The bigger a company gets, the harder it may be for the stock to grow. But at the same time, if he owns enough of the company and the stock moves up, I don't know, it's potentially within a decade or two. I don't know.
You have to be there for that. You have to be there.
Yeah. Will I still be there? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I get, but like with the other thing is, will there be and warehouses and, so I don't know if it's quite as easy to take market share from Amazon. But anyway, maybe I wouldn't be too surprised if within 15 to 20 years, maybe even less. I don't know.
Crazy to think about.
Yeah, I'm not a betting person, so I don't know that. Yeah.
We have another question about Bill Gates and the divorce. Is there anything that surprised you or didn't surprise you from your work?
Well, the timing surprised me. I was surprised by it because they had been together for so long. But, of course, the more that comes out, the less surprising it seems, because it seems like the, kind of happy couple, we do things together, we're co-chair of the foundation, we travel the world, we're going to come talk to, they'll sit together to do a, conference presentation or something. That was, I guess, maybe a little bit more strained than we knew it to be based on what we've been reading. I've been thinking about it because, you see that Jeff Bezos got divorced, and well, we did take a look to see how of the 50 richest Americans, how many marriages and divorces there were. And what we found was the divorce rate among the 50 richest Americans is not that different from the divorce rate for the United States in general. I think it was about 40%. So some people can make it work and some people can't. I don't know what the secret formula is. I do feel like, you get to have, it's gotta be so weird to be, talked about and referred to as the richest or one of the very richest people in the world. And how does that not go to your head? And I never want to be a billionaire. And I tend to think that more money, more problems, because it's challenging. It's not always, people think, oh, I would die to win the lottery and have all this money, but then everybody and all your friends will come out of the woodwork saying, can I have some of your lottery winnings, right? Doesn't make it easy. So, I don't know if it's not, maybe not like that. If you're a billionaire, people aren't asking you for lottery winnings, but they would probably want you to give to their foundation or, give to that cause or invest in this company. Or how do you know if people like you because you're you or because you're a billionaire, So it's kind of money, people, I think it's a challenging, it's a challenging situation to be one of the richest people in the world. And how do you remain normal? Hard, I think.
Yeah, I was reading.
How do you raise your kids? How do you raise your kids in a normal? So they think, because it's a very rarefied world, flying around in private jets and stuff,
Yeah. And it seems like even, they could have kept the announcement private, but because so much is at stake for the markets, they had to make an announcement and, say, don't worry, everything's going to be taken care of. The foundation's, the management's not going to change, the operations won't change. It's just crazy to have so much riding on just one, personal relationship.
And we'll see, they say that this foundation's not going to change, and maybe it won't, but at the end of the day, they've both promised to give away most of their net worth. We'll see if they really do that, and we'll see how they do that, and if they're going to use the Gates Foundation as their main way to do that, or will Melinda use this Pivotal Ventures, her own arm, to do some of that? I don't know. We'll see. I think this will unfold. And at a certain point, I figure she'll be ready to talk and tell a little bit more of her story. I don't expect it to be anytime really soon. Yeah, it's been fascinating. It makes you realize how much you don't know about people. Kind of back to my point is like, somebody asked, are they nice? It's like, well, we have very limited, time with these billionaires, and they may be being nice because they want to be seen as nice, and people come across in one way, but who knows what they're like, when they're home behind closed doors. So, I don't know.
That's a very intriguing place to leave it, I think. Very mysterious. But yeah, I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. But thank you so much, Kerry. This has been a very fascinating conversation, personally, and I'm sure for the audience. And yeah, keep up the amazing work. We're definitely watching all the stories that Forbes is doing. And thank you.
Thanks, Anastassia. Great talking to you.
Thanks.
All right,
Take care.